Okay, everyone, this is episode 4 in our series on Luke Acts was written to win an appeal. This is based on the book by attorney John Mauck of Chicago. And the title of the book is called Paul on Trial, the Book of Acts as a Defense of Christianity. This is a transformative book which will change the way you look at the book of Acts completely. And it explains so much about the book of Acts. And in this episode, we're going to look at why did Luke include Paul endorsed a pagan god as his god? And this was more proof of Mauck's thesis, but he overlooks it. And we're going to ask why that, but also we need to know this proves Mauck's thesis even again more thoroughly, because we're going to see there's no way that this would appeal to a Christian audience. What I'm going to show you, and once you know the truth of what Paul's doing, you'd be revulsed by Paul once more, but you as a pagan would go, this man's our man. This man is great. So wait till you see what I'm going to show you today. So this is another proof of Mauck's thesis, which he overlooked or well underplayed. And it's a well-known problem, and it's well spoken. I mean, it's hard to imagine he missed all this, and you're going to see he's missed a ton of stuff that was important to prove his thesis. So it's hard to imagine he missed this, but apparently he did. But we can now bolster his points. So we need to know what he omitted that we could then bring forward to help make his points even stronger. But they also are very bad reflection on Paul. So that kind of makes our other point about Paul too. So why did Luke include Paul endorsed a pagan god as his god? More proof of Mauck's thesis. That's our topic today. It's really he endorsed pagan gods is what we're going to see. It's not just a pagan god, but pagan gods. All right. So Paul is in court. This is what was explained by another scholar that says we didn't realize. I mean, actually, it was Mauck who explained this in a prior episode, that we are in court. The Areopagus is on the hills of Athens, and he's holding court. He is the head judicial officer of the court of that region, and he's inquiring about Paul, about the controversies about what he's been doing or what's going on. So clearly, this is an examination and likely under oath, therefore. So if there's any lie going on here, it's going to be violative of God's principle that you cannot bear false witness in court, in testimony that you give under oath. Anyway, this is what Paul says. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. And then he goes into, God does not live in temples made of human hands and so on, which is biblically false. We've gone through that before with everybody. That's in 1724. But I'm not here to prove he made a biblically false statement. I'm here to prove that actually this statement itself was a lie, and it was deliberate. And Luke is including this because this is a good lie. In other words, this is a lie that will help win the trial at the end of the case. So it doesn't matter. The pagans are going to be going, okay, this guy's understating what that inscription says, because we know what the inscription was. And I'm going to we'll see why. Jerome knew what it was, and he put it in a print what it was. All right. Okay, and we're going to look at a book by Thomas Fulton, 2021, University of Pennsylvania Press. His book is entitled The Book of Books, Biblical Interpretation, Literary Culture, and the Political Imagination from Erasmus to Milton. This is an academic, but he's going to tell us some things that are very revealing about Paul by telling us about something that Erasmus noted himself. And Erasmus, just so we know who he is, he's a man from the early 1500s who compiled for the first time what we also known as the Textus Receptus, basically a compilation of Greek texts that he thought were the best. And he took primarily two Greek texts, combined them somehow, and then mixed them with the Latin Vulgate where there were differences. And that became the Textus Receptus, and that became the King James Bible. And that's why Erasmus is so famous. And he was, in a sense, the first Protestant, because this is his launching of this synthesis in the early 1500s is what created the imagination. And we're talking like a decade before Luther even gets involved. this created the imagination that if we could have Bibles in our own language, we could grow and we could learn about the Bible and learn Scripture. So this was revolutionary. Anyway, so this is the book of books, and so now Mauck in his text. So before I read you these quotes about Erasmus, I want you to know how Mauck views the unknown God passage, because that's what Erasmus is going to talk about and reveal the truth. What Paul said was a pious fraud. We're going to go get into that in a minute. So Mauck recognizes Paul's the unknown God passage proves Paul teaches no new religion in the upcoming appeal before Nero. So this is, remember, the book of Acts, if it's written for pagans, it's going to have things that have no interest to Christians, but only interest to pagans, or primarily an interest to pagans. And this is another one where, as I said before, Christians would be revulsed to know the next verse, which is, God does not dwell in temples made of human hands. When Jesus says clearly that when you make an oath by the temple where God lives and dwells, you're making an oath by a temple that has been made of human hands for God. And so Jesus contradicts Paul straight on. So Luke is not citing this for Christians. We would see the inconsistency between Paul and Jesus, but for pagans whose gods live on Mount Olympus, verse 24 is great. Now we're going to see why verse 23 is great for pagans. They love this, that he's using this inscription to educate them as to their own religion, but proving he's not really coming with a new religion at all. So here's what Mauck says in his book in Paul's defense. Verse 19 also states that Paul was taken before a tribunal. Okay, so he's backing up four verses before the key verse, verse 23. So now we know we're in court. The Areopagus and interrogated. So Paul is interrogated, meaning he's under oath. Paul gives a defense which not only connects the judges with his evangelistic message, the unknown God, in verse 23, that's one we're looking at, but also brilliantly defends the legal charge by asserting that the God he worshipped and was proclaiming was already inscribed at an Athenian altar. Mr. Mauck's going to regret that. Let me just say this. If he didn't really know the truth here, so I'm going to suppose he doesn't know the truth yet. Verse 27, as some of your own poets have said, can also be seen as a legal argument for the proposition that Paul was not teaching a new religion, evidenced by his appeal to authorities that his audience would have recognized. So, and I'm just going to say here, in the same vein, the reference to the inscription on this statue to the unknown God, which is a very well-known statue at the acropolis of Athens, and we know what it says. And Jerome is going to tell us what it said, because he was living at the time when you could still see the inscription, and he's going to tell us what it was. But let's keep going here real quick. Okay, so now we're going to get back to that book I said. So the book was the book of books, and now we're going to see this description of what's a pious fraud in this statement of Paul. So Paul's statement is, I have even found an altar with this inscription to an unknown God. That's a pious fraud. So let's see why and what that means, a pious fraud. And so in the book of books, Fulton explains, as in the note to Romans 1, verse 11 to 12, Erasmus applauds Paul's pious cunning, pia vafrikie, which Jerome apparently also noticed. And here's a quote from Erasmus, unknown God. Jerome, that means the guy who wrote the Latin Vulgate, and it was the Pope's assistant in the 300s, where basically he issues the Vulgate Bible in 405 AD. That's the full translation he did of the Hebrew scripture and all the Christian scripture. Jerome points out that Paul used a certain pious cunning, pious frauds they're called, because he changed something in the inscription. He omitted not a few things in order to twist the sense, that's detorqueret, more servicely towards a ground, an exordium, a rhetorical beginning through which to preach Christ. So this goes back to Romans 3, verse 7, where Paul says, if my lie is advancing the gospel, why am I still called a sinner? And the NIV has convinced some people nowadays that, oh, well, that could not possibly be coming from Paul. So they've invented some extra words they put before that. And now they've actually literally put in the text with no brackets, no warning. It says, some may say, and then it has the original verse there that was that if I lie to advance the gospel. Why am I still called a sinner? Crazy. But here you're going to see this is exactly what Paul's doing. So the NIV needs to roll back their biased lenses and their rose-colored glasses. They don't want to see that Paul actually endorses this. And this is where you can see pious cunning in its best light. And I mean, frankly, this is close to being almost, if you're on trial for your life, this is great. this is you're seemingly in agreement, but not completely, but you're seemingly in agreement with their God, and you're adopting their pagan God, this pagan God statue, as we'll see. So let's continue, and I'm going to stop for a second. Okay, so now Erasmus is going to continue. This is a quote, and this is from that book, the Book of Books. The word detocore might be translated, so this is Mr. Fulton describing, might be translated more neutrally than twist. But Erasmus' point is that Paul has cunningly shifted the meaning of the original. Indeed, Erasmus and his contemporaries usually use detorquere and torquere negatively when their opponents have twisted the meaning of the scripture. He uses the word in the diatribe with Luther, where he describes how people, quote, twist detorqueret, whatever they read in the scriptures into an assertion of an opinion which they have embraced once for all, end of quote. Paul's usage is far from praiseworthy, though there must be a hint of irony in Erasmus's choice of word. In Acts 17, Paul has, quote, twisted the meaning of the inscription in order to insert Christ into the Athenians' minds. More than just interpreting, Paul left something out, changing God to gods. We're going to learn what the actual inscription says, I think. Erasmus goes on to explain how Paul transformed the original text, meaning the original inscription. For the inscription thus had by the author in the manner cited from Jerome to the gods of Asia, so this is the inscription, to the gods of Asia and Europe, according to Jerome. Remember, Jerome lives in the 300s, late 300s. He can go to Athens. He travels the world. He travels to Jerusalem all the time. He stays there for decades. He's passed through Athens many times. He's seen this statue we're talking about. And he tells us what it says, to the gods of Asia and Europe and Africa, and to the gods unknown and wandering. Then the comment continues here. Erasmus is continuing. Out of the gods unknown, he, meaning Paul, made a God unknown and omitted the mention of the remaining ones. So he is what? Falsely describing what the inscription actually said to the Areopagus, who's not far from where this statue actually exists, and probably knows that Paul is, I would think, Paul is lying. But he's lying for basically saying, I'm defending this one God. But he's not saying there's one God. He's saying, I'm defending this one God. That's my God among your pantheon of gods. And so Paul is cleverly shifting the meaning of the word. So he's endorsing a pagan God, the unknown God, but in context, it was the unknown pagan gods. So the Areopagus might smile, if you ask me. But it's one of those pious frauds. Maybe it could fool the Areopagus, but clearly what you're saying, I'm no threat to you. My religion is no different than yours. I believe in a God that you believe in, and that's it. That's really what he's saying. Now this is the longer gloss, and this is basically also shows you how disturbing though it is. So to me, as a Christian, you cannot make this argument Paul did. It's offensive. Just the whole idea of adopting a statue. Remember, God says you can't make an image of me, and Paul's saying this is my God and points at a statue of Yahweh. This statue, the unknown God, is supposed to be Yahweh. That's like an offensive thing. That violates the whole idea of having graven images to represent God. So, I mean, there's so many levels of which he's doing wrong. The lying of what it says is number one. That's a bad thing. And he's under oath, so you're never supposed to lie under oath. And two, he's using the statue to be an image of Yahweh, which violates the first commandment. I mean, so many things he's doing wrong, right? If you're a Christian. So this is not meant for Christians. This is meant for pagans to win an appeal before the pagan Nero. And this whole point I'm making to you is, why does Mauck not see this? This is another one of these great proofs of his claim that this book was never written for Christians. The reason it's never released till 170 AD, this doesn't come out of cobwebs until about 170 AD. That's the first time it's even cited or quoted by any of the early church. And that's why everybody says, oh, this was written late. This was written late. No, it was in the archives in Rome the entire time. It had to be. It was for an appeal. Anyway, so This is a long gloss that eventually was removed by Erasmus because it's embarrassing if you think about it. So he says here, the long gloss became even longer in the edition of 1519, in which Erasmus added the daring commentary that would remain through 1535. So after 1535, it disappears. I think Erasmus is dead by that time, and they take this out. In this manner, indeed, I think there is truly an image of the state for those who seek to lead pagans or princes corrupted by bad upbringing towards piety, lest they directly make reproaches and exacerbate what they wish to remedy, but instead, while dissimulating, lying, dissimulating many things, gradually lead them towards a better mind. And perhaps it ought not to be blamed if good men act in the spirit in the courts of princes. So testifying in court in front of a prince is okay to lie if you're leading them to a better frame of mind. That's what he's saying. And gradually steal into the mind of the prince. Basically, you're lying your way. You're stealing your way into the mind of the prince by giving him all these false views, but it's to help God. So it's all good. That's what he's saying. So long as they are not the doers of deeds that are openly wrong. So as long as you haven't really transgressed anything like killing somebody openly. But if it's something, you're doing that's misleading, it's no big deal. So long as they are not the doers of deeds that are openly wrong, although they may be permitted to overlook certain ones unwillingly. Okay, so let's see, is there anything else here? Okay, and then the author of the Book of Books, he comments here, a biblical gloss by Paul has been transformed into a commentary on the conditions of speaking in court. So Erasmus is saying that when you're in court, lying under oath can be maybe seen as a good thing. Maybe it ought not to be blamed when it can steal into the mind of a ruler to do good or believe in a fact about God that's true. The only problem is when you're using lies to make someone believe in a God that is true, wouldn't the pagan really realize you're lying? If they realize you're lying, then wouldn't they believe your God is a liar? Yes, that's probably right. So it's going to backfire in the long term. So Paul's idea of lying for God under oath in court always backfires, because why would anyone think his Christ is scrupulous and worthy of being admired when I find out his ministers are lying to me in court under oath? So this is not a good strategy, but Paul adapted it. However, for Luke's point of view and Mr. Mauck's thesis, this is an ideal proof of the point, meaning a Christian who would read this text would see right through it. It's a lie. You don't lie in court, violate the 10 Commandments, forget it. Paul again, in verse 23, we now know if we knew the inscription, like Jerome did, we would say Paul is lying and it's improper. But a pagan, they're only caring, hey, he believes in our pagan God, the unknown God. And even if they found out he's lying, it wouldn't much matter to them. It would be, that's probably the way their God operates. Their gods are liar. They sometimes lie. They sometimes tell the truth. Their gods are very ambivalent on that issue. So Paul would get a pass, and more importantly, he would not seem threatening because he's endorsing the unknown God or gods of Asia, Europe, and so on. So this is probably perfect for purposes of the appeal in front of Nero. This lie of Paul will work out fine in the appeal in front of Nero. And that's what Luke's objective is, to win this appeal and have Christianity not banned. And that's what Mauck's whole point of his book was. Somehow he misses this. You can see how major this is. Jerome has commented on something that directly bears on the thesis of Mr. Mauck, that many of these passages do not have any positive impact on Christians, but negative impact on Christians, but a very positive impact for pagans to rule in favor of Paul and Christianity. But we continue. And I thought it might be worth hearing how another translation of this passage from Erasmus in Praise of Folly, his book In Praise of Folly, how that would be perceived. So an author named Christopher Rays, in his book In His Name, Author House 2010 at page 152, quotes this, and he introduces it in a very sarcastic manner. Even the prodigious early Christian writer Erasmus must make known the dishonest dodge of the apostolic pedigree, that great apostle of persecution. And quote, indeed, St. Paul minces, this is now Erasmus talking, indeed, St. Paul minces and mangles some citations, which he makes use of, and seems to wrest them to a different sense from that which they were first intended. By the way, that's a criticism of Paul's entire way of citing and quoting scripture. It's always out of context, absolutely opposite when you read the original context. When he says there's none righteous, it's in the context of there being a group of righteous people. And it's not talking about all of humanity, and it's not all the time. It's just in that one setting. And it wasn't literally to be understood that way, because in context, there's the righteous and the non-righteous. Anyway, just digressing. Okay. As is confessed by the great linguist Saint Jerome. Thus, so he's now getting to this statement by Saint Jerome about the unconquered, the unknown God. Thus, when that apostle saw at Athens the inscription of an altar, he draws from it an argument for the proof of the Christian religion, but leaving out a great part of the sentence, which perhaps, if fully recited, might have prejudiced his cause. He mentions only the last two words, that is, to the unknown God. And this, too, not without alteration, for the whole inscription runs thus, quote, to the gods of Asia, Europe, and Africa, to all foreign and unknown gods, plural. The Praise of Folly, Erasmus, page 292 in his edition. So you can just see there's a greater context that even the Book of Books didn't tell you what the full context of the quote was, because it was even more negative than he wanted to let on. And I thought you should hear the full context of the quote. And basically you can see, so I asked the question in this slide, would Luke go to the bottom of the barrel in order to win an appeal for Christianity? And basically use this, even though Luke, is there with him, and he's seen the inscription. He's walking around with him, and they probably both noted it. He knows it doesn't say that. He says to the gods of Asia, not, and then it says unknown gods. It doesn't say unknown God. So I presume that Luke knew, and I'm a little questioning why Luke would countenance this. This is where you can't. He's crossing a line here where he's letting his client lie. But anyway, sometimes criminal defense attorneys let things go a little bit too far. If you ask me, this is a little bit over the edge. And more importantly, for purposes of the thesis of Mr. Mauck, this book was not written for Christians. We were not supposed to see this dirt even against Luke. Now it's a little bit getting on his. It's hard not to get dirty when you get involved with Paul, because you're now involved in his lying, and you have to defend his lies in order to get an appeal victory finally with Nero. But that's what ends up happening. We're going to win the appeal, thank goodness. But this is a lie. Okay, now I want to show you one more thing that's in Mauck's book that I only spotted by virtue of searching this word unknown gods. And I saw that actually Luke himself, not Paul, makes a claim that two pagan gods were looking over them as they sailed from Alexandria on an Alexandrian ship. And I had never noticed this before. So he literally himself is adopting two pagan gods for purposes of making a point, which is pretty low, bottom of the barrel argument. So Luke is descending, if you ask me, from my high estimation of him into he's getting tainted by Paul. So watch what he does here. Truth and Perjury, Acts 28, verse 11, page 180 of Mauck's book, Paul on Trial. In this transition paragraph, I just want to make sure I have this here. Yeah, 180. Okay. In this transition paragraph summarizing a journey of about 2 weeks from Malta to Rome, Luke gives the reader fascinating details. Fascinating. They sailed on an Alexandrian ship, quote, with the twin gods Castor and Pollux. With the twin gods Castor and Pollux, as if pagan gods are with them. Now, that clearly isn't meant for the pagans of Rome, okay? So he's including it for them. He's including it for Theophilus, the magistrate. He's including it for Nero to win the appeal. I get it. But Luke, you shouldn't have gone that far. So this is how far he's going to try to win the case, by making them think this. And you'll see Mauck's going to say that's exactly why he included it. It's not a mistake. It's not a mistake in text. It's not a corruption. This is what Luke meant. If Acts is written to acquaint the Roman hierarchy with the Jewishness of faith in Jesus and to defend Paul against his accusers, what conceivable purpose does Luke have in including this detail? Of course, the same question must be asked if one assumes Acts was written to Christians. So he's saying If this was meant for Christians, why would he ever include this detail? And the answer is it was never meant for Christians. I would say this is now conclusive. Christians would never want to know that Luke is saying that 2 pagan gods were on this ship taking care of them. And we continue. If anything, the Castor and Pollux details and the, by the way, I'm going to stop for a second. Okay. And now, so I have to stay here on this slide first. If anything, the Castor and Pollux details and the uneventful sail from Malta to Rhegium to Puteoli, when juxtaposed with the preceding catastrophic storm and shipwreck, imply that the protection of the pagan gods was superior to that of the God of Israel. Ooh, do you see what he's pointing this out? That's why this is now showing that they had the God of Israel protecting them before, and they ended up in a horrible storm. But now they're mentioning Castor and Pollux. Luke is mentioning Castor and Pollux, and now they're having an uneventful trip. It's sad. That's sad what he's doing, but that's, he's trying to win an appeal. So whatever it took, that's where Luke's going. That's how far he's taking it to win. And that's why, again, Luke Acts is not meant for Christians. It's meant for pagans. That's why Jesus is quoting the Bacchae play of Euripides and talking about quoting Dionysius, the dying son of God, God the Son, who's also son of God. Yeah, that's a tragic thing that is going on. But I mean, that's what Paul said, so he's taking advantage of that. Obviously, that's too much to imagine Luke is making up. Okay, now here's his comment on all this, because this is sickening, right? But he's going to now cite other people who say it. Well, it's just what you got to live with. Brian Rapsky notes that D. Lattiser suggests that the function of the particular gods, quote, and this is Castor and Pollux, the guardians of truth and the punishers of perjurers. So that's what their twin roles are, apparently. May be set forth as, quote, one more argument in a sequence calculated to persuade the reader of Paul's innocence. Okay, so again, what Mauck's going to be saying is, well, what reader? Christians? No. Pagans. This will help pagans believe Paul's innocence. So this is really, he's setting this up perfectly to make his point. So he then says, Mauck does, this is not a detail, the twin Roman gods, which Luke would include to persuade messianics of the truth of Paul's defense. Correct. And here would have the negative effect, right? Rather, it is a coincidence, I don't know what that means, which would be immediately appreciated by a pagan Roman jurist without explanation by Paul. It's not a coincidence. It's a fact that you're stating is true, which would be immediately appreciated by a pagan jurist without explanation by Luke. You don't have to tell anybody what you meant. We get it. These were the gods guarding you while you were on this ship. In addition to the forensic reinforcement from the Castor Pollux detail, Luke may be evangelizing again. Really? I don't think so. This is where Luke actually falls down in evangelizing. But of course, Mauck just seems to want to have to come to Luke's defense. So let's see what he says. Just as Paul used the unknown God in Athens to point Greek intellectuals to Jesus, meaning the end justifies the means, Luke appears to be using Castor and Pollux to point polytheistic Romans to Paul as the messenger of God's truth. I'm sorry, it's the opposite. He's pointing to the polytheistic Romans to Paul as another polytheist, because Paul is teaching the truth of the gods, the pagan gods, because these recipients of Paul's words know the inscription is talking about gods, not God, and so Paul is claiming his God are the gods that are on that inscription. Even if Paul is relating it incorrectly, they can kind of read between the lines. Paul's saying, "I believe in the same gods you believe in." I mean, that's as likely an inference that you would arrive at if you're a pagan as if you could believe there's some one God. Who believes in one God? That's how pagans think. How could there just be one God? Look at the universe; it's got all these multifaceted things, and so they looked at the proof of the multiple gods based on the variety of nature rather than the genius of one single mind could invent all of this stuff. So anyway, so you can see there's more to this whole theory of Mauck. Clearly, he's right. And the Castor and Pollux thing, I think, puts an end to the whole argument that this was ever meant for Christians. It could never be meant for Christians. Never, 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 never. Anyway, here's his chart of arguments and where he places this point in Acts 28 about the 2 gods. So remember, he's saying that you can categorize all the arguments in defense of Paul in the book of Acts using these two categories in the middle here. The charge being defended, there's two charges against Paul. He has an illegal new religion that he's teaching. So he's basically upsetting Judaism and, all that stuff. And he's inciting civil unrest. And he says on the left there, he says the defense is Paul's God had even caused the Roman gods to attest to Paul's innocence. Okay, that's a nice spin. It's really Paul's gods are Roman gods, and they are the same religion. That's really what he's saying. But he's putting a nice spin on it. That's okay. So it defends against the illegal new religion and against civil unrest. And then he cites Acts 28:11. Roman gods of truth and perjury convey Paul to Rome, and that's the truth. That's what it said, and that has to be something Christians wouldn't want to know about. And we are never told about it, are we? Are we ever told about this? Is this ever highlighted when you go to Sunday school? No. And are you ever told that Paul's lying about the inscription on that unknown statue? No. Are you ever told that it's a pagan thing and it's a statue of Yahweh, supposedly? That's what he says. And God prohibits statues of Yahweh. And yet he's saying, that's my God. That's my God. That statue is my God. Do we not have... But none of our pastors, none of our teachers will ever teach us the truth about any of that stuff. Okay, everybody. So I hope this makes the point that that Mauck had much more proof of his thesis than he ever let on to, whether he knows about it or not. But we have the Castor and Pollux proof that he does catch perfectly. He gets all the details on that correctly. And he exposes that Luke is willing to go that far, which is extreme. And he misses completely that Paul is lying about the inscription in order to win over the pagans, but at the same time be ambivalent and make it appear that he doesn't know that it's multiple gods that are on that inscription. So the pagans can take it whichever way they want. And that's perfectly satisfactory for Paul to do that. And that's what Erasmus calls pious fraud, or pious cunning is the way he put it. And then the secondary lesson from all this that's unrelated to the Mauck thesis is that we can disprove the NIV's assumptions that Paul doesn't believe in pious frauds when we can see the pious fraud in Acts 17, verse 23, when he says, I saw the inscription to the unknown God. That's a pious fraud because he knows it says unknown gods of Asia and Europe and Africa and so on. Anyway, okay, I hope that helped everybody. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.